Again, this is Valerie Cartonio with the Prison Pod. Thank you for letting me join you. I want to remind you that this show is your show, and one of the unique things about this program is you can write to me your show ideas and questions and comments about any of the programs that you hear. Our address is The Prison Pod, Post Office Box 294, Orono, and that's Orono, Maine, 04473. Well, we've been really lucky to have a great guest join us today. Leigh Goodmark is joining us. She is the author of the book Imperfect Victims, and that is only a tiny little bit of the work that she does. So I'm going to welcome Leigh right now and ask her to give us a brief background story of herself.
So thank you so much for having me on Prison Pod, Valerie. I really appreciate it. I started practicing law at 24 years old, and since then have represented victims of gender-based violence. When I started doing it, I was largely representing people in civil matters, divorces, and protective orders, and other kinds of things. And very quickly started to recognize that the legal system was not doing a particularly great job of protecting victims of intimate partner violence. Flash forward like 20 years, and I had become a law professor who was teaching law students to do those same kinds of cases when in 2013 I picked up my first parole case of a criminalized survivor and was hooked, immediately hooked, and realized this is the work that I was supposed to be doing. Since then, my clinic, which is now called the Gender Prison and Trauma Clinic at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law, has represented probably somewhere between 50 and 100 survivors of various forms of gender-based violence, including rape and sexual assault, intimate partner violence, sex trafficking, other forms of violence. We represent folks in parole matters, in post-sentencing motions, in federal commutations. We've had a presidential pardon. And we do a lot of policy work around the issues confronted by both cis women and trans and gender nonconforming folks in prisons. So we work with quite a few incarcerated trans women now. And so my whole work, both scholarly, kind of the stuff that I write, as part of my job for the law school, but also the work that I do as a lawyer, is all about helping incarcerated folks who've experienced some form of trauma get out.
You mentioned gender and women, and I just was thinking of something. How much of corrections and programming were designed around men, and how does that play with the women that are incarcerated?
All of corrections is designed with men in mind, and the reason for that is, of course, that men are a much bigger part of the prison population than women or trans or gender nonconforming folks. But the problem with that is that we have a very draconian idea about what men need, and we've made no accommodation for women at all. So, if you look at things like strip searches, strip searches are invasive for everyone. For rape victims, they're a form of torture. If you think about the dehumanizing way that we talk to people, that is horrible for everyone. But if you've experienced emotional abuse, that is kind of playing right into those same brain wirings that operated when you were emotionally abused. It's triggering the same kinds of emotions. So prison replicates the trauma that many incarcerated women were experiencing on the outside, and it's that much worse as a result. And people have tried to do something about that, and do is in quotation marks for me, by creating what they call gender responsive or trauma informed prisons. But gender responsive prison can mean anything from we offer cooking classes, we teach you how to sew, to we're happy to have you caged with your child for some period of time until the child can be taken away and given to folks on the outside. And the idea of trauma-informed prisons is just ridiculous. Prisons are a trauma factory. There's no way to make an inherently traumatic institution trauma-informed. And so the kinds of things that folks have tried to do to make the experience less harmful for women, it's just inadequate.
Okay, and that's going to bring me right to the title of your book, Imperfect Victims. Would you explain to the audience what that means?
When we think about who victims of gender-based violence are, we may have kind of a range of pictures in our own minds based on our own experiences with the folks that we know. But when the legal system looks at a victim of gender-based violence, they expect to see something really particular. You're white, you're straight, you're cisgender, you're middle class, you're meek, you're weak, you're passive, you don't fight back, you don't get angry. And so the kind of pathway for a victim of violence through the criminal legal system is pretty narrow. And if you don't conform to that stereotype of who a perfect victim is, you will find it very, very difficult to get the criminal legal system to believe that you've been a victim in any way. Once you've been targeted as a defendant, right? Once you are named the defendant in a criminal case, it's like a switch flips for police and for prosecutors and for judges. There can only be one victim and one perpetrator in a case. You don't get to be both. And so if you are the perpetrator, by definition, you can't be the victim. So if you make some claim to having had an experience of abuse in your past, or even a claim that's tied directly to the crime, the folks who are involved in the criminal legal system are looking for ways to kind of take you off of that perfect victim path. So maybe you were angry, so then you're not a victim. Maybe you have mental health issues, then you're not a victim because you're not credible. You have substance abuse issues, then you're not a victim. You're a person of color, particularly you're an angry black woman, then you're definitely not a victim. You did sex work. Even for white people, you have to be the right kind of white person for your victimization to be recognized. So you can't be a strong person. You can't use foul language. You can't, use any kind of physical violence to protect yourself. All of those things prevent you from being seen as a perfect victim.
So then the women are actually victimized all over again.
Absolutely.
By the system.
Absolutely.
And then the correctional system, and then society when they come home.
Yeah, and so
if they come home.
If they come home, right? I mean, extreme sentencing of women is growing disproportionately. I think it's 1 in 8 black women in Maryland is serving a life sentence, something crazy. So if you kind of look at that path, right? Once police decide that you're not credible, then what they write in their reports is what goes to prosecutors. And prosecutors decide, well, the police don't think she's credible, so we don't think she's credible either. And because of all the power that prosecutors have in the system, they're got a thumb on the scale, and the judge is looking at you and saying you're not credible. And of course, by the time you get to corrections, if you've been convicted, that means that your story has been rejected. And any claim of abuse that you might have made to explain why you did what you did, to kind of provide context for why you did what you did, all of that is deemed to be a lie, right? None of it is credible anymore. So for corrections, you're just an offender. And if you're an offender, nobody cares about your victimization.
Boy, isn't that the truth? Boy, oh boy, you kind of took me away there for a minute, sorry. Your book is powerful. Of course, I've been doing this work myself for 20 years, so I was aware of some of this. But let's be honest, your book is story after story after story. You cannot close your eyes to what's going on once you've read your book. It's powerful bringing this to people's attention. Like I said, I've read a lot, and people were saying, you have to read her book. And I'm 3/4 of the way through. I was hoping to finish it before we were done, because you've really done a wonderful job representing so many women that have been in a situation that has brought them to where they're at, that wasn't 100% their fault. They were already victimized themselves before they became into the situation of being the so-called perpetrator.
Well, that means a lot to me, and I really, really appreciate it. I think the thing that has made me the happiest about the reception of the book is that the folks who have read it, who have been criminalized survivors or who have loved ones who are incarcerated, that it's resonated with them. And this book really came out of actually work with my own clients. So as I said, I represent folks at the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women primarily, and then some folks who are in other institutions as well. I was co-facilitating a group for lifers at the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women, and we were trying to find a project to do together. And we decided we would write a book together, that the women would tell their stories, and I would frame them using the legal information, using kind of social science research to kind of give context for their stories. And the warden supported it, but the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services said no. And so the women said to me, do it anyway. It's important to us that our stories get out there. And a bunch of the women in that group were women I was already representing, so I knew their stories pretty well. Their response to the book means more to me than anything else. And I have, one client who's been texting me as she's been reading it and saying, I just appreciate that you see this and you're helping people see this in the way that I lived it and experienced it, and not the way prosecutors said that it was, and not kind of the horrible monster that they said that I was. And I have another incarcerated woman who's writing to me and saying, like, as I was reading the stories, I was writing the names of every woman I know who has the same story next to it. She said, I felt like I was in church and I was testifying as I was reading the book. And honestly, like, I care that, other people appreciate the book, and mostly I just want it to make them angry. Like, that's the goal. I just want people to be as angry about this as I am. But the thing that means more to me than anything else is that we did what we wanted to do, that my clients wanted to be seen for who they are. They wanted the ways that the system was re-victimizing them to be clear to people on the outside. And I think we've been able to do that with the book. I think the other thing about it is that, lots of people have written about this, and I owe dues to so many different people. And people like Beth Ritchie and Angela Davis and Miriam Kaba and Andrea Ritchie and Black feminists who've been doing this work forever. People have been saying this stuff for a long time. I think the contribution this book makes is to show you how the legal system is accomplishing this re-victimization, kind of all the different mechanisms that it uses to do it, and why it can do it the way that it does it, and why reform that tinkers around the edges of the system isn't ever going to really change that. So it's more just putting everything together in one place to say, these isolated things that people have been talking about for a long time, they're part of a big pattern, a big structure. And if we look at that structure from the time that kids are coming into juvenile detention through the time that we're doing, commutation with governors and presidents, you can see how it's operating in all of those spaces.
You talk about the youth, and what could be changed right now in the way that we handle youth and they become justice involved anyway?
We could close every detention facility. I mean, we could just not have secure detention of children anymore. Hawaii's done it. There are places that are doing away with secure detention of children, and I think that's a first step that we could take, without a problem. We could invest the money that we invest in youth detention in the families who need it. And so when we're taking kids out of homes because those homes are unstable, right, rather than making them more unstable by taking resources out of communities, we could resource those families.
I've often said that about foster care. If the families had the resources that they needed to support the child staying in the home, because that's a lot of times what it is
Yep.
Whether it be you have two parents that are working, or if there's one parent, or there's something going on in the home that's not stable, then bring those resources into the families rather than to divide the family up.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the same thing is true of juvenile detention. I mean, they're bringing kids, girls and trans and gender nonconforming youth into the system because they're doing survival sex work. Okay, well, why are kids doing survival sex work? Because they have to survive. So how do we make it so that they have safe spaces in which they can live and thrive and get the education that they need and get the love that they need, that doesn't look like the foster care system and doesn't look like horrible group homes and doesn't look like juvenile detention? We can do that in community. We have the capacity to do that work.
Wonderful points. I'm going to switch over to something, because there was some terms in your book that I want to make sure that people are familiar with. And one of them is abolitionist law.
Yeah, so abolition is kind of the idea of getting rid of the prison system and all of the things that feed the prison system. So it's defunding the police, and it's getting rid of prisons, and it's getting rid of prosecutors, but it's also getting rid of the things that stand in for prisons and prosecutors, the mental health system, the family policing system, what some people call the child welfare system. All of those places that Vicky Law and Maya Chenwar have written this great book called Prison by Any Other Name. That's all about the systems that substitute for the prison system, that kind of feel like prison light. So it's getting rid of all of that stuff. And abolitionist lawyers are people who are trying to use their power within the legal system to kind of burn it down from the inside, I guess, and to get rid of those things from the inside.
I love that definition. That was great. Okay, so I have a couple more. The other one was carceral feminism.
Carceral feminism. When I was 24 and I came out to do this work, I thought that all men, and at the time we were only talking about men, who committed acts of domestic violence should be locked up, and that should be it. They were monsters. There was nothing we could do to redeem them. That was the way to deal with that problem. And that's a product of carceral feminism. Carceral feminism is the idea that we should be using the state's punishment power, policing and prosecution and incarceration, to end gender-based violence and to end other forms of gender-based oppression. And it very much came out of kind of the later parts of the women's movement, but not exactly. Because the women's movement was very much a grassroots movement. It was about community and other kinds of things. But there was a kind of a legal section of that movement that said, no, it's not community that's going to fix this problem. The problem that we have is that police and prosecutors aren't doing their jobs. But if they did their jobs, there'd be no more gender-based violence. And in my second book, Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, I argue why that's not true. Criminalization is not decreasing or deterring intimate partner violence. It's in fact making many of the things that can correlate with intimate partner violence worse. But carceral feminists believe really deeply that that's the way to do the work, through the carceral system, through prisons and policing and punishment. And some people see it as an insult. When you talk about somebody as a carceral feminist, that's kind of an insult. I just think of it as a descriptor. It's somebody who believes those things to be true. It was me. My Twitter handle is Recovering Carceral Feminist, Ask Me How. And the reason for that is because, I think it's really important for those of us who did come from that perspective to own it and to explain why it is that we've come to change our beliefs over time. It's important for people to see that you can change.
Love that. Because so many times we get stuck in a belief, we don't even know where it came from. It's just how we've always believed, so we keep believing that way. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it wasn't the right thing to be taught. So how about restorative justice? Does that come into play here somewhere?
It absolutely does. I am a big believer in restorative justice and transformative justice. So I think of transformative justice as kind of the bigger umbrella term that's about helping people to find justice in ways that don't involve punitive state systems or punishment systems. And within that, there are lots of ways we can do that. Restorative justice is one of them. There's a lot of fear among the anti-violence community about the use of restorative justice to address gender-based violence. And that fear comes from a couple of different things. One is a concern that we'll kind of go back to the bad old days where police and prosecutors didn't do anything about it, which in my opinion would be a good thing. There's concern that it would re-privatize violence, that by making gender-based violence the problem of the state, that's brought it into the public sphere. And if we use restorative justice, that'll just push it back into the closet. And then there's concern about safety. How do you do restorative justice in cases involving gender-based violence in a way that's safe for everyone? But again, in my second book, in Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, I've written about how I think you can actually do this work and do it safely. And in fact, it's being done all over the country, and places like Impact Justice have thought a lot about how you do restorative justice work in the context of gender-based violence. half of people never call law enforcement in the first instance when they experience gender-based violence. Very few cases ever come to even be prosecuted, let alone involve convictions. So we're all doing some form of transformative justice already, because the vast majority of cases never make it into the criminal legal system. But we're doing it without resources, we're doing it without training, we're doing it without knowledge and without acknowledgement. And I think if we were upfront about the fact that many folks can't have their justice needs met through the criminal legal system because what they need is not punishment, they need something else, and that we're already doing this work in community, then we could do it in an intentional and better resourced way.
I have just something that came to my mind, but is there anything that addresses people that are transgendered or non-binary when they go into the system? I would think that would be devastating.
If there's one group of people that is abused more than any other in the system, it's trans women, and particularly trans women of color. It is the treatment that they receive is appalling. In Baltimore, which is where I am, we just had a trans woman sue the state for her treatment in the Baltimore City Detention Center. But that's what she describes in her lawsuit is completely consistent with what we hear from our clients who are trans women who are incarcerated. They are unsafe everywhere they go. They are housed with people who pose a real danger to them, who either are so transphobic that they are abusive or who may be sexually abusive of them. And then the answer to that is to put people in segregation, solitary confinement, which is torture for long periods of time. And when the trans women that we represent kind of say, look, you can't put me in with this person, I'm not safe with this person, they're charged with refusing housing, they're seen as the problem, they're put into segregation. Then getting gender-affirming healthcare, getting hormones, getting gender-affirming clothing, all of that is an uphill battle. And so you find that, for trans women, just surviving on a day-to-day basis is a real struggle. They're so victimized in every way that you can possibly imagine. And so, my clinic is devoted to doing work on their behalf because we recognize that while everyone is harmed by this kind of trauma factory that is prison, trans women really are uniquely vulnerable.
Is there any type of training that you're aware of for the staff of the prisons for this area?
There's training, but the problem with training, and I say this as somebody who trained judges as my job for 3 years, is that training works when people are open to it. But we have correctional officers who are bringing in the same kind of hateful, hurtful, destructive biases that we're seeing in the anti-trans legislation all over the country. That exists in these correctional officers too. They are transphobic. They refuse to use people's pronouns. They refuse to treat them with dignity. They refuse to see that they are people who are being oppressed and victimized, and training doesn't do any good to kind of overcome those deep-seated transphobia that a lot of them feel. And then, some of it I think is well-meaning but really destructive. In Maryland, they have a card that they give to trans folks that gives what pronouns are supposed to be used and who's supposed to search them. And people are referring to it, I heard the other day, as the Star of David card, because it's like the yellow stars that Jews wore during the Holocaust to mark them out as who they were. And so for some trans women, they don't even feel safe having this thing that's ostensibly supposed to protect them because it marks them out for victimization. There are a couple of things that are happening that give us, I think, some reason to be optimistic, very, very, guardedly optimistic. In New York, for example, there's a law called the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. And what that law does is allow a judge to make a determination that domestic violence was a substantial contributing factor to the crime. And that if domestic violence was a substantial contributing factor, that one of two things, right? That either the imposition of a mandatory minimum is too harsh, and therefore the judge can give less time than the mandatory minimum would require. Or for somebody who's already been convicted, if you didn't get to raise these issues at your initial trial, you can raise them now and ask for a sentence reduction. So similar to the second look legislation that's happening all over the country, some of which is for juveniles and some of which is for geriatric offenders. There are also these second look bills for domestic violence survivors. And they are having some impact. In New York, my dear friend Kate Mogilescu and the Survivors Justice Project that she helps to lead, they've gotten, I think, somewhere between 25 and 30 people out using the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. So those kinds of tools can help us to do that work. And I know in Louisiana, there's a law that's pending that would do that. In Oklahoma, there's one that's pending to do that. In Oregon, they were trying to get one and didn't quite get it this time. In Illinois, the same kind of law exists. So there are ways that we can chip away at this problem, and second look legislation is one of those ways.
Is there anything that I haven't asked that you're just dying to talk about?
The one thing that I am always dying to talk about is something called material witness warrants. Material witness warrants allow for prosecutors to ask that victims be jailed pending their testimony if their testimony is determined to be by prosecutors really, really important for the case. So you have a victim of violence and that victim gets subpoenaed and says, you know what, I don't want to be part of this case for whatever reason. Prosecutors can have that victim locked up. That makes me insanely crazy. The idea that we're locking victims up just because prosecutors want them that way and because prosecutors want them to be part of these cases, they shouldn't have that power. And we could get rid of those tomorrow if we wanted to, and we just don't. The other thing that makes me crazy is parole. I do a ton of parole work with my clients, and there are a couple things about parole that make me crazy. One is how hard it is to get a parole commissioner or parole board to understand the context within which a crime takes place, to accept that somebody can both be victimized and have committed a crime. And also that we allow prosecutors to continue to have any role in parole when they don't know what a person has done since they've been incarcerated. They don't have any idea what the programming has been. The only exposure they have to that person is at the original time of prosecution. What useful information could a prosecutor possibly have to give to the parole board? None. And so the fact that prosecutors get to then come in and say, I still don't think this person should be released, based on nothing, makes me crazy. Those are the things I would want to talk about.
You bring up a great point, because our prisons are full of people that probably could have been let out a long time ago. These extensive sentences, especially during the drug crimes, they're very punitive, and we don't do a whole lot to restore people. We don't look at the trauma that happens before they ever enter the system, and there's a lot to be done. But with people like us talking about these situations and what's going on in the world, can open some people's eyes, I hope. Because your book opened my eyes, and mine were pretty wide open to start out with. And I was just blown away about how many, and you're one person writing about this. Mm-hmm. How many thousands of other stories are out there just like these?
I think Beth Ritchie has said that she never met an incarcerated woman, black incarcerated woman, who was not a victim of trauma. I've never met any incarcerated woman who was not a victim of trauma. And I think the same is true of most men, honestly, too, that there are very few people who come to violence for the first time as perpetrators. Most people come to violence for the first time as victims in one way or another. So then we send people into these trauma-inducing places, and we don't do anything to help them process what they brought in with them, whether that's a substance abuse history or mental health history or just working through their trauma. And then, if they're lucky, we send them back out into the community, or we just leave them there. And we've done nothing to solve the problem. It's so infuriating. And, 10 years ago, before I started doing this work, I didn't know that. I know it because I go into prisons on a regular basis. I think one of the things that the people who love prisons have done so successfully is that they've locked the problem away, where most people, even well-meaning people, even people who would care, never get to see it. And so they don't know. They don't know what happens in prisons. I've told my law students, I don't think you should get to be a prosecutor if you haven't spent some time in a prison. You need to go see what it looks like and be okay with the fact that that's where you're sending people. And if you can't do that, then that's not a job you should be doing. And I feel that way about everyone who votes. If you vote, you ought to know this is where your resources are going, this is where your tax dollars are going, is this really what you want? And it's not, because I think some people don't care. I think some people legitimately think prisons are a good thing, and they'd be happy to see how horrible they are. But I think most people just don't know. And the more that we can get people, Brian Stevenson says, proximate to the problem, right? The more that we can have people understand what that experience is like, I hope the more people's minds will be able to change.
Comment about the going into the prison. There's a lot that goes into that, between the fear, the coldness, the sounds, the smells, that feeling of always someone watching you. Even though you know that you're there and you haven't done anything wrong, you still know there's 1,000 eyes on you. And I've thought that social workers should have to visit prisons. And anyone who work with children that have incarcerated parents. I'm really surprised at how little people do go inside the facilities. I was fortunate in a lot of ways because I had 20 years of going in multiple facilities, and you get that feel, and I think you have a different sense of empathy once you've been there, especially if you went in with empathy.
Yeah, I think that's right. My students are floored. Every semester when my students start going in, the very first time they come out, they explain to me I have this overwhelming guilt that I'm leaving somebody behind in there. And they never felt that before. That's not something they were ever in touch with before. And these are the people who are going to become lawyers. They'll be politicians. They'll be in positions of power in society. I just don't think anybody who's in one of those positions should be able to say or do anything that puts people in prison without having experienced that.
That's a really good place probably for us to wrap things up. Before we do, though, I want you to, again, talk about your book, and you have a second book. Where can people find those?
So I've written 3 books, and they're all on all the places. So you can get them on Amazon, or you can get them through Indie Bookstore. They're available through the University of California Press website. So you Google it, and it'll come right up. And as far as I know, we've sent a fair few copies of Imperfect Victims, this new book, in through prison book projects. So if you're working with a prison book project and you hear this and you want copies, please get in touch with me, because I might be able to help you out and give you some copies of the book, and we can send them inside. And as far as I know, we've gotten probably 300 or 400 inside so far, and they haven't been turned away yet. So far so good.
That's great. And how about a website? Is there a website?
There is. It's just my name, LeighGoodmark.com, and it's got links to all the stuff that I've written as well as the books. That's
great. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today on the Prison Pod. I want to remind everyone, don't forget to write. Post Office Box 294, Orono, Maine, 04473.